George Russell's arrival at Mercedes perfectly coincided with Lewis Hamilton's decline in form. No one expected George to be pushing Lewis Hamilton as soon as he joined the team. He was meant to play the role of understudy until Lewis retired. Instead, he's challenging Lewis in every session, something Lewis hasn't had to deal with since 2016. Can Lewis cope with a competitive teammate? Or is George's surprising success causing issues in the team? Let's check it out. George Russell's move to Mercedes had been a long time in the making. Everyone knew that he was headed that way after a few years at Williams to find his feet in Formula 1. Those years at Williams gave him much more than a firm footing though. He learned how to drive some of the weakest cars on the grid. He learned to drive cars that don't perform perfectly every weekend, cars that lose the back end way too often, or just understeer you straight off the track. Moving to Mercedes for the 2022 season, they weren't skills anyone thought he would need. It was Mercedes after all. Their cars had dominated for 8 years. Why would they not create a near-perfect vehicle again? We all know now that the W13 wasn't perfect. It was good, just not perfect. George's recent history suited that, and he made the most of a car that had its problems. Lewis, on the other hand, really struggled. For the past 8 years, he's been behind the wheel of the best car on the grid by a long way. At no point from 2014 to 2021 did it look like any constructor could challenge Mercedes over a whole season. Obviously, the Drivers' Championship in 2021 is the only blip in that record, but the Mercedes was still the superior car that year. But if you look further back, you'll realise that in his 312 race starts, Lewis has only ever been in a car that can't challenge for podiums for half a season. That was for 9 races back at the start of 2009. Obviously, a driver of his talents would never have to drive for a backmarker team. He would have been snapped up instantly by a top team if he ever looked like his contract was going to expire. What I'm saying is that their experience, especially during the time George has been racing in Formula 1, has been very different. George is used to having to make do with what he has and make the best of a bad situation, and that showed last year. It gave him the chance to challenge Lewis on a race-by-race basis, and his excellent driving in 2022 was rewarded with the team's only race win that year. Why would that cause tension in the team though? As far as everyone is concerned, Lewis is still Mercedes' #1 driver, and for good reason. Well, George has shown his qualities. He's the future of Mercedes, and as far as the team are concerned, the two are free to race. Lewis hasn't had great relationships with his teammates when he's been really challenged by them. In his debut season, he royally pissed off Fernando Alonso, which resulted in the Spaniard leaving the team. Everyone knows the stories about Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton. That 2016 season is legendary. He got on a bit better with Jenson Button, but there were definitely moments when the two butted heads, like when Hamilton released the team's telemetry information on social media to show why Button had outqualified him at Spa in 2012. In 2022, Lewis had his reasons for being beaten by George. He was testing experimental fixes at a few races in the first half of the season that didn't work out on occasion, but George's season was still spectacular. Despite all the fuss about the W13 being the worst car Mercedes had ever seen, George only finished outside of the top 5 3 times. Once at Silverstone when he got out of his car to help Zhou Guanyu, and then at the miserably wet Singapore and Japanese Grand Prix. There is no reason why this season won't be the same, and George will push Lewis all the way to the end. Considering Lewis's record with competitive teammates, it isn't that surprising that things are starting to get heated between the two already. Hamilton was beaten by Russell at the Bahrain Grand Prix 2 weeks ago. The younger of the two Britons was 4 tenths up in qualifying before racing his way to 4th with Hamilton P5 on the night. 5 seconds behind his teammate, the 7-time world champion implied it was luck that helped Russell on the day. "I think if I had the setup George had, I would have been in a better position," he said. "There was like a 50-50 choice. I chose one way, he chose another. More often than not, where he went was the wrong one, but it just happened to work. Maybe Lewis is right. Maybe the choice George made would have been the wrong one most of the time, but this time it wasn't." Instead of just congratulating his teammate, Lewis decided to take a dig at George and make an excuse for being beaten by him in the race. This comment on its own might not have meant much, but George's response hinted that there might be more going on. "I don't think there's any luck in it at all," he said in Thursday's driver press conference for the Australian Grand Prix weekend. "I think it's down to the preparation you put in before the event. The changes we made overnight, I knew that was going to be the right direction with the work we did with the team. And I believed I was going to be better than the setup that Lewis opted for. I think everybody's got different preferences. I was happy with the direction I took and the work I'm doing with the engineers. Clearly, George isn't happy with his decision being described as a 50-50 call. He put all the work in and looked at all the data just as Lewis will have. When you work hard and everything comes together, you don't want someone to tell you it was just luck. Lewis did almost give an apology for saying that George lucked into a better setup. It kind of sounded like someone had said to him that he needs to change the narrative about his 50-50 comment, but his heart wasn't in it. He said, "I think people probably, from my choice of words at the weekend, I want to reiterate how great a job George did on the weekend," the 7-time world champion said. "I think the thing I was commenting on is that there's one specific thing that you can change in the suspension that you have to do over Friday night. And when you make the change, once you start P3, you can't change it for the rest of the weekend. So when you make that change, you're basically rolling the dice. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. I've done it in the past. Sometimes it hasn't worked, sometimes it has. And it worked great for George and he did a great job." Do you see what I mean? It kind of feels like an apology at the start, and then he says you're basically rolling the dice. Clearly, he's of the opinion that George's choice was still down to luck, not due to Russell working something out on Friday that he hadn't. Lewis doesn't like being beaten by his teammates. No Formula 1 driver does, and this sounds like him finding excuses for why it happened this time, but George was having none of it. Sky Sports' Craig Slater thinks this might go further yet this year. This is a big subplot this year because Lewis Hamilton was outscored by George Russell last year, and that's only happened twice before in his career by a teammate. Jenson Button did it once and Nico Rosberg did it in slightly fortuitous circumstances where Lewis had lots of reliability problems. But last weekend in qualifying, George Russell outqualified Lewis Hamilton by 0.4 of a second. That's a big gap between teammates. Maybe it stung Lewis a little bit. This weekend's Australian Grand Prix will be the two's next battleground. The track in Melbourne has been altered a bit since last year, and it should be quicker than last year now. Not as fast as a track 2 weekends ago in Saudi Arabia, but it will demand the same things of the car. George obviously found something in his setup that suited the demands of Saudi Arabia better than Lewis's setup did. Lewis Hamilton's 2008 title rival Felipe Massa was recently asked if Russell is able to challenge Hamilton at Mercedes. Massa explained his achievement in 2022 was a rare one within Mercedes, with only 2 drivers having outscored him in the past, though he did forget that Jenson Button existed. "I trust him to do that," Massa explained of Russell's title challenging credentials. Don't forget, last year in his first season at Mercedes, he left Lewis behind in the World Championship. An incredible achievement. Before that, only Nico Rosberg in 2016 had achieved this in Lewis's entire career. George is a top driver. Considering where Mercedes are at the moment, until they bring significant upgrades to the car, they might just be racing each other on track. With Lewis's history with his teammates and Russell's continuing success, the battle between the two of them could be the only thing they're fighting for over the course of the season. If there is tension at the moment, that's only going to increase in the coming races. Do you think George can beat Lewis again this year? Or was it just luck in Saudi Arabia that let him beat his teammate? Let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. And until next time, drive safe and bye for now.